Hi, I'm Simon Peacock. Welcome to this VLearn Masterclass on Leadership. It's my privilege today to be joined by Professor Tim Morris of Oxford Said Business School. Professor, thank you. I'd like to ask you first of all if we could define the term leadership.
I think of leadership as influence with a purpose. So wherever you're leading, in a charity, a large corporation, your own business, clearly the idea of leadership is one where you're trying to drive or direct people towards some particular type of goal or purpose. But they're not just doing that for any old reason. They're trying to direct them towards some sort of goal. Some of it may be much more directive, but generally influence covers the idea that they're trying to push people in a particular direction.
I'd just like to, if I may, touch upon the public perception of leadership at the moment. It seems we have crisis and scandals breaking almost on a weekly basis, many of which are thought to be as a result of a failure in leadership. Does this reflect badly on leadership education, or do you feel it highlights a need for further research into this area?
It reflects certainly badly on leaders, but you mustn't get the impression that all leaders are poor. There are many people who are doing an extremely good job in terms of their leadership. But I mean, we know a lot about why leaders have contributed to failure. I mean, in terms of banking, this is obviously around poor incentives or incentives which created massive risks. I think that's combined with a problem we've known about for a long time, which is the idea that leaders become too confident. They begin to believe in their own PR, and the consequence is that they neglect to think about the possible risks of failure. A third thing, I think, funnily enough, around what we've seen recently is the idea that actually we put too much faith in leaders to be able to solve all of our problems. Ironically, we expect too much of leaders. So, for example, I think what we've got to understand around some of these failures is that there are limits to what leaders can do. They're only human, and sometimes we ask them to do jobs which are frankly just beyond any one person. In terms of the implications for research, certainly we need to keep understanding these things. Some of this is well known already, but I think what we've got to do is to keep understanding why it is that leaders fall into these traps, or we allow them to fall into these traps.
There are many different leadership styles which are cited in management education. How is a young person to know which style is right for them?
Sure, leadership style is something which we've known about for a long time, and it's been a major area of research. I think the thing here is to understand that for any individual, you've got to focus on what your own particular style, what feels natural to you, what you feel comfortable with, but recognize there's room for change and room for adaptation. And so the key to developing your own leadership style is to work with the grain rather than against it, but be aware of the idea that you should be able to develop and broaden. And you can do that simply by experimenting. And the other part of this is to be able to reflect on what you're doing, what works well, but what doesn't work so well.
What is your opinion on the distinction between leadership and management, and how do these two labels become misconstrued?
They do get misconstrued, and there's a lot of misunderstanding about what they're about, but I tend to think about it like this. First of all, we tend to think of leadership as being a lot more these days about change, inspiration, and also to do with the idea that we're trying to influence people partly by getting to their emotions, getting people to commit to each other, whereas management seems much more like a sort of managing the system and keeping the system going as it is, and it tends not to focus so much on the emotional aspects of relationships between people, so it's about an interaction which is much more on a rational level. But the other thing I'd say about this is there's clearly overlaps, so managers have to lead, so management involves leading involves some form of management as well. You can't expect leaders to do nothing but, as it were, lead without making decisions which fall into the management area. So there's clearly overlap, but I think they touch on those two different things. First of all, leadership is about change, and it's much more about emotion. Management is much more about maintaining the system and operates more on a sort of rational basis.
If I could just ask you about leadership culture, if I can paint a hypothetical scenario where a graduate returns from a course back to his or her organisation and realises that there's an outdated command and control culture in place, where do they start in trying to bring about change?
Well, the first thing I'd say is don't rush into it, because classically you come back for a course, a program, a leadership program, and you're full of good ideas, and you've got to recognize the rest of the organization hasn't been with you, so they may well look at you with some suspicion. Take your time. The second thing is you've got to understand and be able to articulate to yourself what is it that you want to change and where do you want to get to. So not just I want to change, but you've got to have a pretty clear idea of where's the direction of travel, what do I really want to achieve here. The third thing is to recognize this is hard. I mean, unless you're a very, very influential person, powerful person, you've got to recognize that these things are not easy, so it won't happen overnight. And you've got to take your time about this, unless there's a massive emergency, but basically don't expect it to happen straight away. The other thing is, most importantly, you've got to build allies. You cannot do this on your own. So the most important thing for me is always to recognize who your supporters might be and work with them, and as well to understand where the opposition or resistance might come from, and be able to think about, well, why is it that people are opposing? How am I going to deal with any opposition to this? Where is it from? How powerful am those who oppose me? And think about, therefore, how am I going to deal with those people as well?
Do you feel that leadership, in essence, is something that can be taught in a classroom environment?
Unsurprisingly, I do. I think that I'd qualify that, though, to say that what we can do in a classroom is to teach various things about leadership or various aspects of leadership, but we can't be the substitute for the real thing. In other words, I think of leadership as development in particular, and developing effective leaders has three components to it. First one is experience. There is simply no substitute for experience, and I can't give people that. What I can do is get them to reflect on their experience, and I think that the most important thing I can do with people in the classroom is to get them to take time out, give them some ways of thinking about what's going on, and help them to shape their ideas about how they are leading and how others are leading. So that's reflection. And then the last thing is that people have got to be able to try things out, experiment. So the reflection then should lead to what I call experimentation. So try and do new things, try and change. Don't be stuck in the same things all the time, and don't try and make massive radical changes. That looks simply inauthentic. But what you can do is, over time, you can start to try things, to do things in a different way, and that builds confidence in expanding the sort of repertoire of leadership skills that you have. So I think it's the reflection and experimentation that I can help people with. I certainly can't give them the experience.
Professor, you've been carrying out some research into decision making. Could you tell us a little bit about your research findings?
Decision making is something that all leaders have to do. In fact, I think it's one of the defining characteristics of a leader. The leader is the decider. And that's why I got interested in thinking about how leaders themselves make decisions. So we know quite a lot about decision making. We know quite a lot about what leaders do. Funnily enough, we don't know much about how leaders themselves think about the decisions they make. So I and a number of colleagues spent some time looking at this, and we found some surprising results, which I think have got interesting practical application as well. The first thing I'd say is that what we found is that although leaders initially thought that they could split decisions into big ones and small ones, actually they were also thinking about decisions as easy and difficult, and that was different from big and small. And that categorization helped us to think a bit about then how they saw the world. I think there are a couple of surprising results. The first one I'd say is that what they said was that strategic decisions are easy. They're big, but they're easy decisions. And that in itself is interesting. But then it became a little bit more nuanced, because what they were really saying was that the sort of analysing of strategic decisions, or analysing their strategic position, was the easy bit. But the hard bit, the difficult bit, was actually the implementation of strategy. So you got difficult big decisions, but you also got easy big decisions around the whole domain of strategy. The second thing that is an interesting finding out of this is that not all small decisions are easy ones. So typically you'd think of small easy decisions as routine ones. Actually, funny enough, some small decisions turn out to be extremely difficult. One of our informants called these blindsiders, and I think it's a fantastic example. And virtually every leader I bumped into says that that's absolutely right. Sometimes it's the small decisions that trip you over and become incredibly difficult. And so understanding when small decisions are going to turn into very difficult ones is a critical part of understanding how to make decisions as well.
And finally, Professor Morris, leadership in the past has been either an elective or has been a smaller topic within a wider module, such as strategy or organisational behaviour. How do you feel leadership should fit into management education?
It's true to say that leadership has been rather neglected and seen as a sort of sideline in many general management MBA type degrees. I think more progressive places are now starting to think about it in a new way, and so it's becoming an overarching theme, if I can put it like that, a broad theme across general management degrees. And if you frame it like that, so you start people to think about the leadership issues across all of the different types of topics that they're learning about. What are the leadership implications? What does this mean for me as a leader? Then actually you start to see that leadership can be an integrating aspect of your learning across these degrees, and it's a way in which you can start to think hard about what you're doing as a leader, how leadership works, and continue to do that across the whole of the course. So I'm all for raising its profile and actually using it much more as a sort of general theme throughout business degrees.
Professor Tim Morris, thank you very much for your time.
It's my pleasure.
That's all from this VLearn Masterclass. We look forward to bringing you many more.